you actually have much more control in what you can do analytically, with this framework. And again, even within looking at between study predictors, you can still do that, but you'll get estimates that are a lot less biased because you actually have the raw data on hand rather than the summary information from the articles. So this is a great framework, even in a standalone context, but it requires, to just use MIPE, it requires outcomes where the measurement is not all that complex across studies. So people have been using this framework, for quite a bit of time, 20, 25 years, or maybe even more, in medical context. But when you're working in the types of context that we work in, you need to pair this with a cross-study measurement framework that actually accounts for measurement differences across studies, okay? So that's where IDA comes in. And mind you, that's sort of, some think that MIPD, or some have argued that they're the same thing, MIPD and IDA. I argue that they're separate entities. We can have that discussion another time. But all that said, so it's a framework for estimating scale scores for measures across studies that assess the same construct in different ways. It's typically either done with IRT or some form of categorical factor analysis. And your interest there is separating out true mean differences or change in outcomes from differences or change in measurement properties. And usually, at least within IDA, you're looking at differential item or differential symptom functioning, either across studies, across time, certainly across populations. And in this case, we're interested in doing that across measures. At least we became interested in doing that at the time. So, in summary, one of the major meta-analyses in this area of treatment for comorbid PTSD and AOD concluded that there's a need to evaluate optimal treatment pathways. The quality of evidence up to that time in terms of, the summaries of the literature was very low. And that findings that they came up with in their own meta-analysis might be best regarded as preliminary. So this was sort of a call for the field to do more than what they had done up to the time. Well, we argued that this study allowed for better parsing of effect sizes in terms of differentiating between trauma processing and skill building interventions. If you look at within condition effect sizes, so change that's specific to each arm, as well as comparative effect sizes within study, and we can actually model that variation across the competitors, whether you're talking about wait list or a non-credible TAU or even an evidence-based comparator, if you want. And then look at cross and within study examination of optimal matches between treatment types. And then there's combined pharmacotherapy element of this, matching those to seeing what the optimal matches are between treatments and patients. Who wouldn't want to do that? So after what, 3 years, 4 submissions, an institute change, and finally actually getting the same study section to see this thing twice in a row, we got the grant funded this past June. Has I'm not stoked by all that. But, so what we've been doing, up to this point, had planned to do from that point forward, was sort of consistent with what one would expect to be doing in the first year. So we're developing communication portals between ET, which is the executive team, which is all of us that you saw in the pictures. We have a scientific advisory board made up of 4 prominent PTSD and SUD investigators, and then participating PPIs are those that had agreed to participate by sending us data, and they're actually also will be active collaborators with us in the development of a PTSD and SUD consortium. So we reinitiated the search for new studies that either came out since 2016, or were studies that were pre-2015 studies that were missed, dealt with our legal folks in terms of IRB and data sharing issues, figured out the protocol for actually having investigators send us data securely, and then thought about development of a data harmonization template, both with our primary or sort of gots to have measures, as well as our secondary measures. So I want to focus on the data harmonization template because this is sort of where the work begins to diverge. So the idea, at least as I had it in my head, was, okay, we're getting 50 data sets from 30 PIs. We're going to get these data in different file types, different file formats, different naming conventions and structures, even for variables that you would think would be easy to deal with. I think race and ethnicity is straightforward. SCSS would be straightforward. Those are probably not going to be straightforward at all, let alone, situations where we've got, different measures for the same constructs that might be coming from different scales. And all of this requires item level harmonization to a common data structure, for us to be able to structure for analysis. So that was what was keeping me up at night through June and July, among others. So this is where the Deloitte comes in. So I have a knee replacement in mid-July. So I'm probably home about 2 or 3 weeks. Got nothing else to do. I'm sort of checked out of RTI for a good chunk of time. So I'm literally at home on the couch thinking about, you'll remember this, thinking about this data harmonization template. So I'm on my couch in August. I'm saying, well, wait a minute, I'm sitting here bored out of my skull and in a lot of pain. Let me start figuring this template out. And it's like, okay, well, I know I've got one data set out of 50 we plan on getting. So this is Denise's CTN 15 study. So I want to use that as a test case for what that would look like in terms of harmonizing to, a common set of variables and a common naming convention. I still had it in hand from the secondary analysis R01 that we had. So here's the issue. So I created a data template that had room for one and only one measure per construct. I mean, it's sort of, for me, it makes sense. I mean, it's a typical situation that you would have in integrated data analysis studies, okay? So you either have one and only one measure for that construct, and you can harmonize sort of across measures, but you're still really thinking about putting one set of data within a column. Or if you've got multiple measures, but non-overlapping items, it would just be missing data for the studies that you don't have those constructs for. So no big deal. Okay. I quickly realized we had a problem on our hands. So Denise's data had multiple reports of the exact same set of symptoms for PTSD. Okay? That's a self-report measure, got a clinical assessment measure. I've only got room for one of these. So it's like, now I'm thinking, all right, well, which one of these do I pick? And immediately it occurred to me, well, picking one or the other is going to have significant consequences. So from previous work, I already knew that, well, Lisa had already seen that these two measures are highly correlated, but certainly not correlated in a way that you would think of them as exchangeable. Okay? And I'd already seen that the self-report measures seem to be more sensitive to change than the clinical assessment measure in terms of looking at it as a mediator of reduced alcohol and cocaine use. And then what am I going to be able to say about the treatment effect size for either one or the other measure? Given that among the same people, when you actually looked at them separately, CAPS, our clinical assessment measure, that the effect size for that is almost twice the size of the self-report measure. So this idea of which one of these I chose is not wasn't going to be a trivial thing, okay? So it occurred to me, though, do I have to pick one? I mean, isn't there a way I could use both of them at the same time? So if we could, then I started asking another question. It's probably the lawyer talking at this point. How could I guarantee that the severity score that I estimate using both measures would actually be the same as the score I get if I just use one or the other? Especially given what we already knew from Lisia's work, where they weren't correlated enough to be thought of as synonymous, where the disagreement rate in terms of symptom discordance between patients and clinicians for the same symptom vary from anywhere, and you'll see this later, anywhere from 30 to 50%. And that validity up to that point in terms of what we had looked at, and we're not guilty of this, certainly, and we're not even the only ones that have been guilty of this in this field. There are folks in other fields that I'm sure that have had to deal with this issue. The notion of validity coefficients being specific to and dependent on that measure. And all of that said is comparing that to some gold standard, where at least thinking of the gold standard of this sort of super score where we're estimating it based on both the interview and self-report. God forbid you try to do this and think about this with comparing the clinical assessment measure with self-report. And then it occurred to me, well, we're seeing something about this notion of IRT equating in some of the readings that I'd done for the grant, but they weren't really relevant at the time. So mind you, it's August. I'm literally have my leg propped up on the couch. I've got plenty of time, so I've got plenty of time to do a bunch of reading. So I'm starting to think about two fundamental questions and sort of gearing up to start, looking at two separate literatures. So this equating stuff, does that really get at this notion of you got different tests that can be put on the same metric? They kind of colloquially, that's kind of like, well, that must be what they do with these standardized tests, SAT, GRE, and the like. And the other question was, had anybody else really given this issue any thought in the PTSD literature, or the literature on any disorder for that matter, in terms of how to deal with discordance between patients and clinicians, particularly, and discordance between measures in general? So then I remembered, well, we've got people who actually are real live IRT experts at RTI who actually train with Dave Bissett and other people who've done IRT software development. Why am I racking my brain trying to figure this out on my own? Let me ask them. So wanted to get a sense for what they knew about this notion of IRT equating, sort of what it was, and could it help us in this situation? And that was the overwhelming response. Was, I don't know what you're talking about. But such as it was, like I said, I had a lot of time on my hands this summer. So my first task was to sort of dig into this literature. So here's what I started thinking about. Mind you, this is all in parallel with sort of the regular grant stuff getting off the ground. But knowing that this is probably going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with for a larger study. So, started coming across a lot of different concepts from the educational testing literature that seemed like they would actually be relevant for us. I'll start off with the concept of equity. And you'll see in places where I sort of translated, our context in clinical settings relative to what they looked at in terms of, or talk about in terms of testing context. So we start off with the fundamental notion of equity, and that it must be a matter of indifference to each patient and their parlance. They use the word examinee. Whether self-report or clinical assessment is given to them relative to them being able to get the same underlying score. Okay? So I said, okay, that sounds reasonable, but given what we already knew in terms of discrepancy between the self-report and the clinical assessment, how does this really relate to us? Okay? So here's the concept of test linking. So a link between scores on two tests is a transformation of some sort, and we'll get into methods of transformation. From one score, let's say we're moving from a self-reported PTSD severity score to a score from a clinical assessment. And which should be done in a way where we can move back and forth. So moving from self-report to an interview should be equivalent in moving from an interview to self-report. So for example, we couldn't do this with just simple regression because the scores that you would get back, you wouldn't be able to back translate those scores. Okay? So there's this notion of both non-parallel linking. So again, you can go back and forth from Fahrenheit to Celsius and back to Fahrenheit with the translation. But these are not parallel measures. The scores are not on the same metric. Same thing with the SAT versus ACT. You see a lot of that in the educational testing literature for non-parallel linking. Parallel linking, an example of that would be multiple versions of the SAT. Okay? So these are all in the same metric, sort of moving back and forth version to version, so on and so forth. Any questions up to this point? So Frederick Lord talks about this notion of what's called strict equity. And I think it's useful from a perspective of an organizing framework. You'll find that it practically won't have a whole lot of use, and I'll show you what I mean. So patients with a given true severity score, we'll call it theta, would have identical observed scores whether you measure them based on self-report or the clinical interview. And if at the individual level you can guarantee identical scores, then by implication, the second point is also true, that the scores would be drawn from identical distributions. And when I saw this, I said, how can that be true when I'm thinking about the data that we have? And again, this is just from one study. We're working on getting the other 49 literally as I speak. The item response patterns in terms of the presence or absence of symptoms between patients and clinician, patient report and clinician report from the same people, I'm like, how can this be true if we don't even have agreement or concordance at the symptom level? And the answer is you can't meet this unless both measures are perfectly reliable. So I said, okay, that makes more sense. I wasn't thinking about this in the wrong way, but this is virtually, it's nearly impossible to meet this standard, even in educational testing. And in health outcomes research, this is impossible to me. So Morris introduces this concept